The black ink hadn't even dried on the demolition order when Mayor Richard Hawthorne slammed it down on his mahogany desk with the force of a man delivering divine judgment. His steel-gray eyes blazed with righteous fury as he stared at the photograph paper-clipped to the legal document. A picture of St. Maria's Catholic Church with its towering spire and the offending statue of the Virgin Mary positioned prominently in the front courtyard. Idolatry, he muttered through gritted teeth, the word rolling off his tongue like a curse. Pure and simple idolatry, and I won't have it poisoning our God-fearing community another day. His secretary, Margaret, shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, clutching a stack of urgent phone messages from concerned citizens, reporters, and city council members who had already caught wind of his unprecedented decision. In 30 years of working for various city officials, she had never witnessed anything quite like this. "Sir," she ventured carefully, "the Catholic parish is requesting a meeting. Father Martinez says there are legal procedures that must be followed, and the Historical Preservation Society is already talking about filing an injunction." Hawthorne's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Let them try. I've done my homework, Margaret. That building sits on city property due to a tax assessment error from 1987. Legally, we have every right to reclaim it, and morally, we have every obligation to remove that blasphemous shrine from our community." He stood and walked to his office window, gazing out at the city he had served as mayor for 8 years, a city he believed God had entrusted to his stewardship. Somewhere beyond the government buildings and tree-lined streets, that statue stood in defiant mockery of everything he held sacred about pure, biblical Christianity. The roots of Richard Hawthorne's crusade ran deeper than most people realized. 3 months earlier, he had stood before the congregation at First Baptist Church of Millbrook, his voice trembling with evangelical fervor as he delivered what his wife Sarah would later call the sermon that changed everything. "Brothers and sisters," he had declared from behind the pulpit, his finger pointing toward the stained glass windows, "we have allowed the enemy to establish strongholds in our very midst. While we worship the one true God in spirit and in truth, others bow down to graven images just 6 blocks from where we gather tonight." The congregation had stirred uneasily. Pastor Williams had shifted in his chair, recognizing the dangerous edge in his mayor's voice. But Hawthorne pressed on, his political authority lending weight to his theological proclamations. The Bible is crystal clear about idolatry. Exodus 20, verse 4 states that we shall not make any graven image or any likeness of anything in heaven above or in the earth beneath. Yet every day, people in our community kneel before a statue, praying to a woman instead of to Jesus Christ himself. If stories like this move you and you believe in moments where faith meets the unexplainable, make sure you subscribe because what happens next will leave you speechless. By the following week, Hawthorne had begun what he privately called his spiritual audit of city properties. He spent hours poring over land records, tax assessments, and zoning regulations, searching for any legal avenue to challenge what he saw as government-sanctioned idolatry. When he discovered the property discrepancy involving St. Maria's Catholic Church, he knew he had found his divine mandate. Father Miguel Martinez received the demolition notice on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide the small community of Millbrook. His weathered hands trembled as he read the official city letterhead, the words blurring through tears he refused to let fall. St. Maria's had been his spiritual home for 15 years, and now Mayor Hawthorne wanted to reduce it to rubble. "This cannot stand," he whispered to himself, then louder to his assistant, Sister Catherine, who had rushed into his office upon hearing his distressed voice. "This is not about property law. This is about religious persecution in 21st century America." Within hours, the parish hall buzzed with urgent activity. Parishioners arrived throughout the day, many still wearing their work clothes, their faces etched with disbelief and growing anger. Maria Santos, whose grandmother had helped lay the church's cornerstone in 1952, wept openly as she clutched her rosary. "My abuela saved pennies for 3 years to help build this place," she said to the assembled crowd. She used to tell me that Our Lady watched over this community from her place in the courtyard. How can they destroy something so sacred? Father Martinez stood before his people, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his heart. We will not respond with hatred or violence. We will use every legal means available to us, and we will pray. If Mayor Hawthorne believes he can drive us from our spiritual home through political manipulation, he will discover the strength of a community united in faith. The battle lines were drawn, and Millbrook would never be the same. The injunction papers landed on Mayor Hawthorne's desk like a declaration of war. But instead of retreating, he doubled down with the fervor of a man convinced he was fighting Satan himself. He moved the demolition date up by 2 weeks, citing urgent public safety concerns that everyone knew were fabricated. "Richard, this is madness," his wife Sarah pleaded across their breakfast table, her coffee growing cold as she watched her husband of 23 years transform into someone she barely recognized. "These are good people. The Martinezes helped us when your mother was in the hospital. Remember?" Hawthorne's jaw tightened as he spread legal documents across the mahogany surface, his pen moving with mechanical precision as he signed order after order. "My personal feelings are irrelevant. Sarah, this is about obedience to God's word. Would you have me compromise my faith for the sake of neighborhood pleasantries?" "I would have you remember your humanity," she shot back, her voice cracking with frustration. "You're tearing this community apart. The city council is talking about a vote of no confidence. Even Pastor Williams called yesterday, asking if you were feeling well." For the first time in weeks, Hawthorne looked up from his papers, his steel-gray eyes meeting his wife's concerned gaze. But instead of the softening she hoped to see, his expression hardened further. "If standing for biblical truth costs me political support, so be it. Better to lose an election than to lose my soul to compromise." He returned to his documents, effectively dismissing her concerns and sealing the fate that awaited them all. The nightmares always began the same way. 80-year-old Richard Hawthorne stood in the cold hallway of St. Augustine's Children's Home, his small fist clenched as Sister Margaret's ruler came down across his knuckle for the 3rd time that morning. The statue of the Virgin Mary loomed above him in the corridor, her painted eyes seeming to watch his punishment with serene indifference. "Protestantism is the devil's lie," the nun had hissed, her black habit rustling like crow's wings. "Your parents abandoned you because God was punishing their heretical beliefs. Only through the intercession of the Blessed Mother can your soul be saved." Night after night for 2 years, young Richard had been forced to kneel before that statue, reciting prayers to a woman he had been taught was merely human. The other children, all Catholic-born, had accepted this routine without question. But Richard's Baptist grandmother had planted different seeds in his heart before her death, seeds that Sister Margaret seemed determined to root out through fear and repetition. The day his uncle finally secured custody and rescued him from that place, Richard had sworn he would never again bow before any graven image. He had buried those memories deep, building his adult faith on the solid ground of sola scriptura and biblical authority. But when he saw St. Maria's statue in the courtyard, something primal and wounded had awakened within him. The 80-year-old boy who had suffered in silence was finally old enough to fight back, and he would not be stopped by legal technicalities or community pressure. This was personal now, and God help anyone who stood in his way. The yellow demolition equipment arrived at dawn like mechanical vultures, their diesel engines shattering the peaceful morning silence that had blessed St. Maria's for 73 years. The massive wrecking ball swayed gently in the crisp autumn air, casting an ominous shadow across the church courtyard where the Virgin Mary statue stood in silent vigil. Father Martinez had been awake since 4 o'clock, preparing for what he knew would be the most important day of his priestly ministry. By 6:30, nearly 200 parishioners had gathered on the public sidewalk across from their beloved church, their voices joining in decades of the rosary as bulldozers and excavators formed a mechanical siege around the sacred building. Maria Santos clutched her grandmother's worn rosary beads, the same ones that had been blessed at St. Maria's altar 50 years earlier. Her teenage son stood beside her, his usual rebellious demeanor replaced by something approaching reverence as he watched his mother's tears fall onto the cracked concrete. "They can tear down the building," Father Martinez announced to his flock, his voice carrying clearly across the street despite the rumble of heavy machinery. "But they cannot demolish our faith. Our Lady has watched over this community through wars, economic hardship, and family tragedies. She will not abandon us now in our hour of greatest need." The construction foreman, uncomfortable with the crowd of praying Catholics, approached the statue cautiously. Something about the painted eyes seemed to follow his movement, though he dismissed this as nervous imagination brought on by the tension of the moment. The first excavator died at precisely 9:15 in the morning, its engine seizing with a grinding shriek that silenced both the construction crew and the praying Catholics across the street. Foreman Jake Morrison had operated heavy machinery for 23 years and had never seen a brand-new Caterpillar simply stop working for no apparent reason. "Check the fuel lines," he barked at his crew, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool October air. But even as his mechanics swarmed the machine, a second bulldozer began experiencing hydraulic failures, its blade dropping uselessly to the ground with a metallic thud that echoed through the courtyard. By noon, four separate pieces of equipment had malfunctioned in ways that defied mechanical explanation. The wrecking ball operator, a grizzled veteran named Pete Kowalski, found his controls completely unresponsive whenever he attempted to position the massive steel sphere near the church building itself. The machine worked perfectly in every other direction, but seemed to refuse any command that would bring it within striking distance of the sacred structure. "This is impossible," Morrison muttered, watching his third hydraulics expert shake his head in bewilderment. These machines were serviced yesterday. Every system checked out perfect. What unsettled him more than the equipment failures were the smaller incidents his crew was reporting. Tools disappearing and reappearing in different locations. Sudden drops in temperature near the Virgin Mary statue that left men shivering in their heavy jackets. And most disturbing of all, the growing consensus among his workers that they were being watched by invisible eyes that seemed to follow their every movement around the holy ground. The emergency city council meeting convened at 7 o'clock that evening, with Mayor Hawthorne facing 5 increasingly hostile council members who had spent the day fielding angry calls from constituents, reporters, and state officials demanding explanations for the demolition debacle. "Richard, this has gone too far," declared Councilwoman Patricia Webb, her usual diplomatic tone replaced by barely controlled frustration. 3 television news crews are camped outside City Hall. The ACLU is threatening a federal lawsuit. And now we have construction workers claiming supernatural interference. "You're making us look like religious fanatics." Hawthorne attempted to respond, but his words came out as a hoarse whisper. The severe laryngitis that had struck him during lunch showed no signs of improvement, forcing him to communicate through hastily scribbled notes that only seemed to increase the council's alarm. "You can barely speak, and you look terrible," observed Councilman Robert Torres, studying the mayor's pale complexion and the dark circles that had appeared under his eyes seemingly overnight. "Maybe you should consider postponing this demolition until you recover your health." But Hawthorne shook his head violently, writing furiously on his legal pad before sliding it across the table. His message was clear: demolition proceeds tomorrow morning. No delays, no compromise. As he drove home through the darkened streets of Millbrook, Hawthorne's hands trembled on the steering wheel. His throat burned with every breath. His vision seemed strangely blurred, and a persistent headache pounded behind his temples. But he refused to acknowledge the possibility that his sudden illness might be connected to his war against the Catholic Church. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Mayor Hawthorne drove through the deserted streets towards St. Maria's, his fever-addled mind consumed by a rage that had been building for decades. The construction site stood eerily quiet, the disabled equipment casting long shadows in the pale moonlight like the bones of defeated giants. He parked directly in front of the Virgin Mary statue and stumbled from his car, his legs unsteady from the mysterious illness that had ravaged his body throughout the night. The painted figure seemed to glow with an inner light that hurt his eyes, her serene expression a mocking contrast to the fury that burned in his chest. "You think you've won?" he croaked through his damaged throat, his voice barely audible in the stillness. "You think your tricks and your supernatural nonsense can stop me from doing God's work?" He raised his fist toward the statue's face, years of buried trauma and religious hatred pouring out in a torrent of blasphemous accusations. "You're nothing but stone and paint. You have no power over me or this community." The moment his knuckles struck the statue's cheek, the world exploded in blinding white light. Hawthorne felt his body lifted from the ground by an invisible force, every nerve ending screaming with electrical fire as a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere spoke directly into his soul. "My child," the voice said with infinite gentleness, "you have been wounded, but you are not forgotten." When the paramedics found him 20 minutes later, alerted by a concerned neighbor, Mayor Richard Hawthorne lay unconscious at the base of the Virgin Mary statue, tears streaming down his face. Dr. Elizabeth Hammond had been practicing emergency medicine for 15 years, but she had never witnessed anything like what happened to Mayor Hawthorne during his third night in Millbrook General Hospital. His vital signs had been steadily declining despite aggressive treatment, his mysterious illness defying every diagnostic test and therapeutic intervention. At exactly midnight, while Sarah Hawthorne dozed in the bedside chair, Richard's body began to convulse with seizures that the monitoring equipment somehow failed to detect. But instead of the violent thrashing typical of neurological episodes, his movements seemed almost rhythmic, as if he were responding to music only he could hear. In his vision, Hawthorne found himself standing once again in the cold hallway of St. Augustine's Children's Home, but this time he was not alone. A woman approached him through the shadows, her face radiating the same gentle compassion he had seen in countless religious paintings but never truly understood. "You were never abandoned," she said, kneeling beside his 80-year-old self who cowered in the corner. "Every tear you shed, every moment of fear and loneliness, I was there beside you. Sister Margaret's cruelty was not my will, but human weakness. I do not demand worship, Richard. I simply offer love to those who suffer." When he awakened the following morning, Mayor Hawthorne's fever had broken completely. His voice had returned, clear and strong. Most remarkably, every test result that had shown systemic organ failure now indicated perfect health. Dr. Hammond could only document the medical facts while privately questioning everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between science and faith. The crowd gathered at St. Maria's courtyard on Sunday morning represented every denomination in Millbrook, drawn by word-of-mouth reports that their mayor had something extraordinary to announce. Richard Hawthorne stood before the Virgin Mary statue that had been the center of so much controversy, his wife Sarah beside him, her hand clasped tightly in his. "3 days ago, I came to this place consumed by hatred and religious pride," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled multitude. "I believed I was defending biblical truth, but I was actually defending the wounds of a frightened child who had never learned to distinguish between human cruelty and divine love." Father Martinez stood among his parishioners, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he witnessed something he had prayed for but never dared expect. The man who had tried to destroy their spiritual home was now publicly confessing his error with a humility that transformed the entire atmosphere. "I am formally withdrawing the demolition order," Hawthorne continued, pulling the official document from his coat pocket and tearing it in half before the crowd. "Furthermore, I am donating $50,000 from my personal savings to help restore this beautiful church to its full glory." The spontaneous applause that erupted included voices from every faith community in town. Pastor Williams stepped forward from the crowd, extending his hand to Father Martinez in a gesture of reconciliation that many thought they would never see. "Perhaps," Hawthorne concluded, "God is bigger than any of our denominational boxes, and love is more powerful than the fears that divide us." 6 months later, The Millbrook Interfaith Council held its first joint Easter and Passover celebration in the newly restored courtyard of St. Maria's Catholic Church. Mayor Richard Hawthorne stood beside Father Martinez and Pastor Williams, watching as children from every denomination in town participated in an Easter egg hunt that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. The Virgin Mary statue, now surrounded by carefully tended flower beds maintained by volunteers from all the local churches, had become an unexpected symbol of unity rather than division. Visitors often commented on the peaceful atmosphere that seemed to emanate from the sacred space, and several reported experiencing unexpected moments of spiritual clarity while spending quiet time in prayer or meditation. Sarah Hawthorne had watched her husband's transformation with wonder and gratitude. The angry, wounded man who had once terrorized their community with his religious zealotry had been replaced by someone who listened more than he spoke, who sought understanding before demanding agreement, and who had learned to see the divine in unexpected places. The miracle wasn't just my healing, Richard often told visitors who came to hear his story. The real miracle was discovering that God's love is bigger than human hatred, and that sometimes our greatest enemies become our most important teachers. Have you ever witnessed something that science couldn't explain? Share your story in the comments below, and let us know if you've experienced moments where the impossible became possible. The demolition equipment had been removed months ago, but the construction of something far more valuable continued every day in the transformed hearts of Millbrook's residents.